Welcome to Pleasurology Island. I'm Free Thought Steve, the lone pleasurologist. Thanks for stopping by. I'm continuing with my series of talks about sexual development, and I'm going to be describing to you my own personal sex history. Not because I'm an exhibitionist, although I am an exhibitionist, but I prefer to be a different kind of exhibitionist. I have no innate need to tell you the secrets of my personal sexual history. However, I think it could be a lot of fun, and I think it could be very therapeutic. I think if all of us shared our sexual histories with each other honestly, without making any judgments, and just looking at our sexual histories as the natural psychological product of the particular social environment that we lived in, the attitude to sexuality that exists around us in our social, or that existed around us when we were growing up, during our sexually formative years, that our sexual desires and preferences are the natural outcome of a sexual learning process that includes our social environment and all the sexy interactions that we have with our environment, which stimulate our emotional brain. And then the other half of that sexual learning is the emotional brain and how it responds to those various sexy situations that are presented to us during our life, and what kind of experiences we have as a result of becoming sexually aroused. Are we able to satisfy our sexual desires in a normal and satisfying way that leaves us happy and safe, and that we have intelligently satisfied our natural psychobiological sex drive? A psychobiological sex drive is biologically built into our brain so that it gives us psychological impulses and urges. It's our emotional brain that gives us the urge to be sexy. And it's not our penis or our vagina that gives us the urge to be sexy. Neither the penis nor the vagina has urges in and of itself. They don't have a little brain down there experiencing consciousness and experiencing urges. All of that's going up inside our head, in our emotional brain, which, as you recall, is located in the very center of our brain. There's the front of our brain. There's the top of our brain. We open the brain up, and in the middle, there is the emotional brain, in yellow on one side and red on the other, because the left and right emotional brains are slightly different from each other, just the same way that the left and right upper parts of the brain are different. And so it's our emotional brain that contains the genetically constructed sexiness recognition centers. Sexiness recognition centers. Could use that as a diction drill to practice your S's and a Z at the end. Sexiness recognition centers of the emotional brain. They are designed to recognize a sexy situation, which deserves an emotional response of becoming sexually aroused and interested and desirous of whatever it is that our emotional brain is finding sexy. So our genes have constructed the sexiness recognition centers in our emotional brain. And as we grow up, those sexiness recognition centers are active from an early age. As I told you a couple of times back when I was talking about being in the bathtub with my mommy when I was 3.5 years old, and the sexiness recognition center in my emotional brain said, this is a fun, sexy situation. It took several baths. We had 3 or 4 baths, I don't remember how many, before my emotional brain started to feel this as a really fun situation in a different kind of way from any other fun that I'd had, except when my mommy was reading me that little story about the water babies in the nursery school book, in the children's story book, with little illustrations of baby children floating around naked in the water, swimming around and having a really good time, and how that actually, my emotional brain recognized that as a fun situation, because I didn't get to grow up being naked very much. I had to wear clothes all the time, as most children do, as all children do, basically, in a Christian culture. And so seeing the children floating around naked in the water was stimulating to the sexiness recognition center in my emotional brain. It said, boy, that would be fun to do. I wish I was swimming around naked in the water, feeling the water all around my body, and it'd be great. Well, and so then that was the winter time, and my dad and my mom and I were in Chicago, and my dad was probably 32, 33, something like that. My mom was 27 and a half, and I was her only child. And she didn't like being in Chicago. She was a California girl, hated the Chicago winter, being cooped up with me in this little apartment while my dad was out, gallivanting around being the youth minister in some Chicago church. And then we moved back to California, and my mom went, hooray, coming back home to Inglewood, California, which was a real nice area in southern Los Angeles suburbs. And they must have bought a little house, a little tract house in a suburb. And my father then went with this other evangelist. They went down to Brazil to evangelize the Brazilians and try and save them from being Catholics and going to hell, and make them into being Presbyterians or Baptists so that they could go to heaven instead. And I should explain that my parents didn't have a sexual relationship. My father was unable to perform on their honeymoon night, their first night after they were married, and my mother very quickly came to the conclusion that she'd married the wrong man, and she was just going to have to put up with that. And I don't think she made any effort to try, and I don't know how much of an effort she ever made to try and create a good sex life, but my father couldn't perform. He had too much sexual guilt, too much masturbation guilt from his own Christian upbringing, and so he had been sexually impaired by his own Christian upbringing. And so they didn't have any children for the first 4 years they were married. And then my mom said, well, shit, if I'm going to be in this relationship, she didn't feel she could divorce my father because he was a minister, and that would have ruined his career. He was just getting started in his career as a minister. So I don't know. And people didn't get divorced back in 1948, very much, unless they were Hollywood movie stars and other people who lived a kind of scandalous life. But it would have been scandalous to get a divorce, and my mother was never one to court scandal. She always liked to be pretty socially conventional, even though deep down inside, she didn't agree with a lot of the sexual repression of Christian society. So anyway, she and my dad didn't have much of a sex life, except when she finally said, after being married for 4 years, she didn't say shit because she wouldn't have said that. It wasn't in her vocabulary, but she said, well, if I'm going to be in this marriage, I at least want to have children or a child. And so she did whatever it took, as she put it to me one time. She did whatever it took to get my father turned on so that they could have sex and she could get pregnant and have me. But then they did not continue to have much of a sex life. And then 3.5 years later, she claims that she decided she wanted to have a second child. My father always suspected that maybe she was fooling around with somebody and had sex with them and thought that she might possibly get pregnant, and so she made a determined effort to have sex with my father one more time on my birthday so that I would have a younger sibling. And sure enough, my brother came along 9 months later. And my father was never positive. He always had this suspicion in the back of his mind that she had all of a sudden been real nice to him because she was afraid of getting caught being pregnant. Because she had been pregnant once before they were married. She'd been working at a radio station. She was a very good-looking young girl. She was just out of high school, 18 years old. And so one of the hotshots at the radio station took a fancy to her and started complimenting her and started going out with her and dating her. Obviously dangling the prospect before her that if she were nice to him, that he would help her have a career. She liked to sing. In fact, that was one of the things she was doing at the radio. She was going there to help sing commercials, because in those days they didn't have taped commercials. All the commercials were done live, and so they had to have people there to actually sing the commercials at the appropriate times. And she had a real good voice, so that's what she was doing. And then this hotshot guy at the station romanced her, got her pregnant, wasn't going to marry her. She had to go to Mexico for an abortion and came back. And it was really, traumatic for her, and then she decides she's going to turn over a new leaf and fly straight, and she goes to this Christian conference grounds for a week at the Christian Conference Center at the end of the summer. And my dad is there, and he's like a last year, he's just about to go into his final year of seminary at Princeton Theological Seminary. So he's preaching these to the kids, he's preaching to the young people and giving them his testimony and being all holy and righteous and like he's God's representative on earth. And so my mom, latches onto him. She decides this is the guy, that now she's going to turn over a new leaf and she's going to dedicate her life to being the wife of a minister, and because she'd grown up religious and all that stuff. And then it turns out, that he was, she wanted to back out of the marriage at the last minute. The wedding was delayed several hours because at the last minute, she refused to go through with it. It was a big wedding. There were the church was full of people. There were lots of flowers. She had a beautiful wedding dress and everything was just to the nines. But she realized at the last minute, she was making a mistake here. That she really didn't love this guy. He wasn't like her high school boyfriend. She'd had a high school boyfriend she was really in love with. But as soon as Pearl Harbor came along, he enlisted in the Navy and went off to fight the Japanese, and so he didn't come back. He survived, but he wasn't back to court her again. And so 4 years later, she married my father. 3 years later. Anyway, so when she got pregnant the second time, my father, he knew about this. She hadn't wanted to marry him. She delayed it for 2 hours. Then she finally agreed. Her mother persuaded her, you've got to marry this guy. Look at all the money they spent on the wedding. Besides, he's got a lot of money. He's inherited money from his father, so he's a good catch. You can't back out now. And all the people are out there waiting. You can't back out now. So my mother felt she had to go through with it. And then that night, my father couldn't perform. It was a bad kind of situation because it was 3 days after D-Day in Normandy in 1944 that they got married. And so everybody's really concerned about what's going to happen, all these people dying on the beaches of Normandy and what's going to happen over there. And my dad, who doesn't have to participate in that because ministerial students, clergyman students, got exempted from the draft. And even though he had started to study, for the church before the war broke out, but anyway, he didn't have to go. But undoubtedly, he probably felt guilty about the fact that he wasn't there, and all those people were dying, and he instead was here marrying this beautiful woman. But anyway, he was just too nervous to perform, and so they didn't have a sex life. except for the 2 times that myself and my brother were conceived. So when I'm in the bathtub with my mom at the age of 3.5, going on 4, she's pregnant. I didn't know that, but she was, and she had. If she had been, having an affair and had made love once or twice with whoever she was having an affair with, she'd nevertheless been able to cover it over by having a relationship with my father, and at least once, so that when she turned out to be pregnant, then he couldn't complain that it wasn't his, but he had his suspicions. Anyway, so they didn't have much of a sex life. But anyway, she's finally back in California. She's put that Chicago situation behind her. She's pregnant with a 2nd child, which she's happy about. She's looking forward to having 2 children because she enjoyed having me, and bringing me up for the first 3 years. She was having a great time. It gave her a purpose to her life, and so she was perfectly happy. And so we were kind of celebrating there. My dad was off in South America, and my mom was in Inglewood in the bathtub with me, and taking baths together and having a big time. And she probably felt very liberated to be able to just, be in the tub with no clothes on, and have me there with no clothes on, and just be splashing around. But then my emotional brain began to interpret this as a sexy situation. Did she intend it to be sexy? I don't think she intended it to be sexy to me. I think she thought I was so young that my emotional brain wouldn't, of course she didn't know anything about emotional brains, but anyway, she thought that my sex drive was undeveloped because I was a child, and children don't have sex drives. Children are innocent. If you've never told them anything about sex, they won't know anything about sex. You see, that was the Christian unrealistic view of children's sexuality. Whereas in fact, those sexual recognition circuits are there right from the start, and they become active, at around 3 years, if not earlier. They can be activated anytime. But the interesting thing is that my sexual arousal circuits, my recognition center, was not activated by physical contact with my body, with physical pleasure. It was activated strictly by the psychological situation, the fact that my mother was there and her breasts were naked, and so I was able to look at her naked breasts, and they were just right there, and she was happy showing them to me and letting me see them. And my emotional brain interpreted this as a sexy situation. And our emotional brains are good at picking up other people's moods. And so it may have been that she was, in fact, turned on by the situation. I mean, if you think about the shape of a bathtub, a rectangular bathtub, if I'm sitting at one end and she's sitting at the other end, bathtubs are not that long. So, basically I'm having to be, she must have had her legs apart, and I must have been in between her legs sitting there, although the water was covering us up to the waist. And so I was only interested in what I could see of her body from the waist up. But she may have felt turned on by the situation. She may have been fantasizing, what if I were doing this with, a grown-up guy, and how much fun would that be? It's, somebody that I was really attracted to, rather than my husband, whom I'm not attracted to and I don't want to do this with. But, so she may have had some fantasy going on in her own mind that was causing her to feel somewhat sexually turned on, and my emotional brain may have been picking up her sexual arousal in some way. Or it may just have been that my sexiness recognitions found, a naked woman with 2 naked breasts right in front of me, and a beautiful one at that, age 27 and a half. The sexual recognition center would be defective if it didn't recognize this as a potentially sexy situation. So it did. And I got the urge to show her my penis. So what has happened there is, first, my Sexiness Recognition Center has recognized this as a sexy situation. And that has caused me to become sexually aroused, to get a feeling in my consciousness of sexual arousal, and probably my penis was also erect, although I wasn't paying attention to that. But I did feel good all over. And then the emotional brain takes that sexual arousal feeling and says, what am I going to do with this? What activity do I feel like doing with this? And the sexual centers of my emotional brain spontaneously gave me the urge to show my penis to my mother, to this beautiful naked woman in front of me. She was being very kind and sexy, showing me her breasts. Well, I just got, my emotional brain just put the idea into my head, show mama your penis. And I didn't have any sexual inhibitions. I've had no reason to think that would not be a good thing to do. I had not been taught anything about, not showing my penis to anyone else, except from having clothes on all the time. But now there were no clothes, so why shouldn't I show my penis to my mom? So as soon as my emotional brain translated arousal into this urge to exhibit my penis to my mother, to the person who was arousing me, I put my hands and feet on the bottom of the tub and lifted the middle of my body up, lifted my hips up, straightening. My knees were bent, but my legs, my thighs were straight, and my upper body was straight. I was holding myself up behind, and so I lifted my penis up so that it was just above the water, and having fun showing it to my mom. And the expression on her face then suddenly changed. A moment before we'd been just having fun, she was relaxed, and we were both just enjoying the situation. But as soon as I showed her my penis, her face, went shock. She was shocked, and it was not a good thing. I could tell immediately it was not a good thing. I've always been an emotionally sensitive person, and so I recognized immediately that I had done something that was not pleasing to my mother, and so I stopped doing it. I lowered my penis again. And pretty soon the bath was over, and we never took another bath together again. I'm sure that seeing my penis didn't scare my mother that much. There are pictures that she took when I was a little baby, where I'm lying on my back. I mean, little baby, 3 months old, maybe, 4 months, 5 months, 6, but pretty young. Lying on my back on an opened up diaper, and I have this big smile on my face. I'm sort of grinning, laughing, and lying there naked, and this stream of urine is coming out of my penis and arcing up and away, and this photograph shows the whole arc of pee being ejected from my penis. And, so my mom wasn't afraid of my penis when I showed it to her. In fact, she used to tell this story. She used to love to tell this story about how, and this was about the same period of time when I was about 3.5, 4 years old, and we had just moved back to Inglewood there. And I'd been across the street where there were two little twin girls, about 5 years old maybe, across the street. And they had one of those children's pools that, you inflate the pool or whatever and fill it up with a garden hose, and the little kids can play in it. And so the three of us have been in our bathing suits playing all afternoon out in the sunshine. And then we got out, and my mom decided to dry me off. So she took off my swimsuit right there in front of the the Wunderlich twins, as they were known. Cute little girls, 5 years old, and I'm 3.5. And when my mom pulls down my swimsuit, one of the twins says, "Oh, look, Stevie has a tail." And my mom used to love to tell that story. She thought that was a really fun story. It was her way of being a little bit sexually daring, to make reference to a penis in company. And yet, it was acceptable because it was a joke, it was a funny story, and nobody said the word penis. It was just one of the little girls said the word tail. Stevie has a tail. And yet it was a story about Stevie's penis that she was telling. And so she had taken that picture of me, with this arc of urine coming out of my penis. So when I showed her my penis, it wasn't my penis as such that upset her, or that suddenly changed her mood. What changed her mood was that I was obviously responding in a sexy way to this situation that the two of us were in. And that frightened her, that somehow I would be interpreting the situation in a sexy way. And I think it just evoked society. All of a sudden, it wasn't just she and me in the tub. It was she and me, and what would anybody think if they found out that I was taking a bath with my son and he was showing me his penis? All of a sudden she had that guilt and anxiety about it. I could get caught, doing something that I shouldn't be doing. And as I said, she was very conventional when it came to the appearance outside, her appearance to the outside world. She was very conventional. And so I think that's what happened there, was that all of a sudden she couldn't handle the situation because I was getting turned on by it. Now, the effect this was my first sexual learning experience that I had. And it was not a positive one. I mean, in one way it was. The first part of it was positive. The fact of being naked in the tub with my mom and getting turned on by it, that was a positive sexual learning experience that was pleasurable to me, and it made being in the water naked with a woman a very sexy ambiance for me, a situation which would always turn on my emotional brain for the rest of my life, because that was the first experience of being sexually aroused that I ever had. But then, it was followed not by a reward, not by any kind of rewarding interaction. There was no reciprocity. She didn't come back, with pleasurable, enjoyable enthusiasm. She was shocked by my penis, and so she responded by withdrawal, basically emotional withdrawal from it, rather than interacting with me and my penis in a positive way, which, if she hadn't been living in a sex-negative culture, she could easily have done. And she could easily have, said, what a nice little penis, what a cute little penis you've got. Bring it over here, show it to me. Let me take a look at it, And she could have admired it, and caressed it gently and said, "Oh, look at that. Look how it's standing up straight and real, all cute like that." And she could have, put one finger over it, rubbed one finger over it, and just tickled it a little bit. And we could have had some fun. And I would have learned that showing your penis to a woman and is something that she likes, that she enjoys, and that I should be proud to do. It would have taught me penis pride instead of penis shame. But in the society we live in, she couldn't really do that without feeling like she was a bad person, because our sex-negative society condemns children's sexuality, basically, and condemns adults for encouraging children's sexuality. Now, what we really condemn, of course, is adults who are unsatisfied in their own sex life, taking advantage of young children who know nothing about sex and seducing them into sexual behavior in order to satisfy the adults' sexual desires that are unfulfilled by their own sex life with other adults. And that is a very legitimate concern and a very legitimate thing to try to not have happen. Adults should not be satisfying their own sex drive through children. What Wilhelm Reich, the father of sex-positive psychology, said was children should be allowed to be self-determining. The children themselves should determine what it is they want to participate in. But that doesn't mean that the adults should shut them down when the children want to participate in a sexy situation and want to have a sexual interaction with someone. If we want to have as our goal people developing a strong and healthy sex drive so that they can use that sex drive to be happy themselves and in their relationships when they're older, then we should be encouraging young people to, when they become sexually aroused, when they choose a sexy situation and become sexually aroused, we shouldn't make them feel ashamed. We shouldn't refuse, to let them do that if that's what they want to do. See, in this case, it wasn't, yes, my mom was taking a bath with me, but it was I who got turned on by it, and I who showed her my penis. No, she didn't ask me to do that, She wasn't trying to satisfy her own sex drive in that way with me. She may have been enjoying a little fantasy thing going on in her head, but she wasn't trying to seduce me into a sexual relationship with her to satisfy her own unsatisfied sex need. But an entirely different kind of attitude toward children's sexuality was found in traditional Polynesia. As I mentioned a few times ago, there's this very good book, Love in the South Seas. It was published in 1956, and here was the cover, pretty nice cover. I cut it out and put it on the inside so it wouldn't get ripped. And then here's the author and his wife, and this is Bent Danielsson, who was born in 1921 grew up in Sweden, where he received the Doctor of Philosophy at the University of Uppsala. 1946-47, he was a member of an expedition to the Jibaro headhunters of western Amazonas, the purpose of which was to study Inca culture. And then after he'd done that, he came back up to the coast of Peru and heard about Thor Heyerdahl and his Kon-Tiki expedition to Polynesia. So in 1947, he accompanied Thor Heyerdahl on the famous Kon-Tiki voyage from Peru to Polynesia. He later made his own expeditions to French Oceania, and in 1952 he participated in an American expedition to the Tuamotu archipelago under the auspices of the Pacific Science Board. For a number of years, Mr. Danielsson, with his French wife and their small daughter, has made his permanent home in Tahiti. So he lived in Polynesia himself, and he researched the literature about Polynesia, and wrote this book. It's called Love in the South Seas, and his name is Bent, B-E-N-G-T, Daniels, D-A-N-I-E-L-S, Son, S-O-N, Danielsson, one word. Chapter 4, A Time to Love and a Time to Live. As might be expected of a people with so emphatic and appreciative an attitude towards sex life as the Polynesians, they made no attempt to suppress sexuality in the younger generation. Parents indeed encouraged their children in free experimentalizing and realistic play. For the Polynesians, childhood and youth were a time of preparation in the respect of sexuality, as in other respects, and they considered, without doubt rightly, that it was of the greatest importance for everyone to acquire as much sexual knowledge and skill as possible before marriage. To begin with, sexual instruction took the quite simple form of not attempting to conceal anything from the children, who from the tenderest age might listen freely to the candid, outspoken conversation of their parents and relations. As all the members of the family slept in the same hut, without partitions in the way of screens or walls, the children often witnessed the sexual act in their own homes and were allowed, as the most natural thing in the world, to be present at nude dancing and demonstrations in the technique of sexual intercourse. Public dancing and public demonstrations in the technique of sexual intercourse. Masturbation was considered quite a natural thing in Polynesia, and parents often urged their children to masturbate when they wanted peace and quiet, more or less the same way we give children rubber nipples to suck on or chew on, a pacifier. They would say, calm down, masturbate and calm down, that'll calm you down. Go play with yourself, don't bother me. When the children grew rather older, they had to learn various sexual games. Daddy, Mummy, and Children, for example, was played much more realistically than our children play it, and in concordance with adult customs, often with 2 or 3 daddies and mummies at once. A native woman from Puka Puka, who has told her life history, says, "As a girl, I loved to play at having babies. We used immature coconuts as babies, just as the little girls do today. Sometimes only girls played this game. At other times, both girls and boys, aged 10 years or so. We played at marriage and intercourse. After a pretended cohabitation, the girl mother stuffed the coconut inside her dress and realistically gave birth to her child, imitating labor pains and letting the nut fall at the proper moment. The girls, of course, acquired their knowledge of how the delivery of a child takes place through being eyewitnesses when their mothers and neighboring women had their children. The idea that it could be improper or harmful for a child to see a delivery never occurred to the Polynesians. On the contrary, it was regarded as an interesting free show open to all. On the island of Raroia, where I lived 18 months among the natives, the whole population always assembled around a pregnant woman as soon as the news that the pains had begun got about the village. The house was filled with men, women, and children, and those who could not get a place indoors sat down on the ground outside. In order that those sitting outside should not miss anything, everything that happened was usually passed out through the window by one of the spectators as if watching a sporting event. Cook mentions that one of the most usual games in Tahiti was an erotic dance. This is Captain Cook, visiting in 1770-something. Quote, "An erotic dance which is performed by young girls whenever 8 or 10 of them can be collected together, consisting of motions and gestures beyond imagination wanton, in the practice of which they are brought up from their earliest childhood." And indeed, it was often a girl's grandmother who taught her how to do these sexy little dances when she was a young girl. And that was, part of normal education. That was part of what a grandmother did for her granddaughter, was to teach her how to dance a sexy hula dance. In the Marquesas Islands, the girls were taught when still quite young to swing their hips and walk in a provocative way, and to assume postural attitudes which were highly charged with sex. Small children imitating sexual intercourse were a common sight on all the islands. Only children of the same age, however, took part in these sexual games, and it was considered in the highest degree improper and abnormal for an adult person to show any interest in them. The absence of compulsion was also due to the religious idea that a child always had more mana power than its parents. So even small children were asked for advice and were allowed to decide for themselves, even in questions of importance. It was thought that when we're born, we have the maximum amount of life energy in us, and that it gradually grows less and less as we get older. So children were allowed to be self-determining, as Wilhelm Reich suggested they should be. It is not surprising in the circumstances that most of the well-known complexes and maladjustments from which our own children suffer are still unknown in Polynesia, because these complexes and maladjustments are symptoms of emotional tension, which is created by an upbringing that tells us that our sex drive is bad and must be suppressed. And so we end up with a lot of chronic organismic anxiety, in our case. And Ben Danielson says, I've not yet been able to discover any serious cases of thumb-sucking, contrariness, bedwetting, daydreaming, nervousness, nail-biting, or stuttering on the islands, where I have lived long enough to know the conditions well. Because the kids were relaxed, because they didn't have to be hiding their sexual interests and their sexual activities. The adults wouldn't interfere with them, and the kids had plenty of room to go off by themselves and find secluded places to play together sexually without any interference by the adults. So there wasn't a conflict between the children and the adults about their sex life. In Polynesia, in addition to the unlimited sexual liberty which the children enjoy in Polynesia and the scanty parental discipline, a Polynesian child has always more than one mother and father. The possession by a Polynesian child of more than two parents is due to the fact that family feelings and kinship terms are quite different from ours. No clear distinction is made between all of the relations who belong to the same generation. So aunts and uncles on both sides of the family are fully equal to the parents. They are considered mothers and fathers, not just aunts and uncles. Of course, all the children know which are their real parents, and equally, of course, the parents keep count of their children. But the collective family designations that these are all my mothers and fathers correspond to real emotional ties. And everyone who is called mother and father, which is usually at least a dozen persons for the child, have the same rights and obligations towards their sons and daughters, who may belong to other families or other nuclear families, but they're all of the same generation. There's a generation of sons and daughters and the generation of parents. If a child feels itself unjustly treated by one father, it goes to another. And if it does not find one mother sufficiently understanding, it may move across to another mother who lives close by. To continue the story of the children's development, they were ready to look after themselves as early as 10 years of age. And at that point, they often stayed away from their homes for many days in succession, without anybody feeling anxious about them. They weren't going to go anywhere. They were on an island. They couldn't go anywhere, basically. So they were safe. The children could always obtain food by fishing and gathering fruits and roots in the nearest field, and they could get a roof over their heads in the nearest house, whatever it happened to be. Sexual experimentalizing became bolder and bolder during this free association in play groups, consisting of both boys and girls, at about the age of 10 and so forth. Many of them at that age had intercourse, though naturally they could seldom attain an orgasm. But little importance was attached to contacts of this kind. Even if the kids were actually having sex before they had puberty, so what? The girl wasn't going to get pregnant. And of course, in Polynesia, when a teenage girl did get pregnant, it was okay. It was fine. The parents' family adopted it, or they gave it to another family who was looking for a baby at that particular time. And so, and it just showed that the girl was fertile, that she was capable of giving birth to a baby. So they weren't so worried about teenage girls getting pregnant. Puberty did not change the young people's lives to any noticeable degree. They continued to live as before, a happy, uncontrolled life full of play and amusement. Their social adaptation was brought about by degrees, and their elders made no great demands on them, which was no doubt the chief reason why puberty and adolescence were not a stormy and crucial period, as with us. As regards sexual accomplishment, however, the Polynesians considered that young people ought to be fully trained as quickly as possible, and took great care that they should obtain expert guidance as soon as they really began to be sexually mature. Additional sexual instruction may seem superfluous, since they'd already been seeing sex ever since they were children. They knew how to do it. And the young people taken all round were certainly pretty full-fledged. Still, in one important respect, their previous lack of physical maturity had prevented them from attaining perfection. And their education, therefore, was now completed with practical instruction in the technique of sexual intercourse. The method employed was that the boys and girls should have their first real intercourse with an older, experienced person. In most cases, this was carried out by older boys and girls who belonged to the same age set, the same group. But often, recourse was had to an aunt, uncle, or other relative of their parents' generation. It is stated that in the Austral Islands, young males received sexual instruction from the Karaois, who were a group of sort of traveling performers who put on skits and comedies, and their message was basically make love, not war. Their patron god was the god Koro, who was the war god, but Koro of the broken spear. He had renounced warfare for sexual enjoyment and friendship with other people rather than fighting. And the Karaois would travel around between different areas of the islands who might be hostile to each other, but they would travel around from area to area trying to spread peace and goodwill, and the message, that it's better to make love than war, and try and reduce warfare in the area by providing everybody with sexual entertainment. So, young males received sexual instructions from the Karaois, and young females received sexual instruction from female priestesses. Courses in sexual refinements were given in the Karaois society. So they would give advanced sexual technique courses. On Easter Island, a German visitor tells us, the girls first received oral instruction from older women, after which they had intercourse with an older male relative. So important was this preparation held to be, that a young woman who was a virgin was despised by all men. According to Peter Buck, who was himself of Polynesian ancestry, the custom on Tongareva, north of Tahiti, was that at the stage of puberty, as shown by the pubic hair appearing, the boy had to be instructed in sexual matters in a practical manner. The boy's father, appointed a woman of mature age to act as his son's instructress. In Hawaii, a boy of noble family was not only trained in warfare and government, but when he was grown physically, a matured chiefess, a matured female chief, was chosen to train him in sexual practices. The years immediately following puberty were the merriest, most carefree time of a Polynesian's life. Boys and girls of that age had as yet few duties toward their parents, and could therefore devote most of their time to song, dance, sport, and amusement. On most of the islands, they formed loosely organized gangs and roamed about from place to place, playing pranks all the time. The parents thought it quite natural that young people should give unrestrained expression to their abundance of energy and joie de vivre, and sexual freedom was always unrestricted. Conditions in the Marquesas Islands are in this respect typical of Polynesia in general. Handy says, one author that studied them says, that during this phase of their life, the teenage years, which they call the Tau Reka Reka, Tau meaning a period of life, Reka meaning pleasure, Reka Reka meaning lots of pleasure. So it was the adolescent years were the period of life devoted to having as much pleasure as possible. Conditions in the Marquesas are in this respect typical of Polynesia in general. Handy says that, quote, during this phase of their life, youths and maids were totally free sexually. An old European resident of the Marquesas has told me that it seems to be an irresistible instinct with natives of both sexes to run wild for a few years after adolescence, in pursuit of amusement in general, but of the satisfaction of their abundant sexual appetite in particular. Although youths and maids at this period usually lived at home, they had absolute sexual freedom. A mother's pride was greatest, and it was a matter of boasting if her daughter had the greatest number of suitors in her train. But now, let me hasten to point out that those kind of sexual customs for young people today would result in basically what we've got, which is an epidemic of STDs, because we've had a lot of sexual freedom since the 1960s that young people have been taking advantage of, and other people too, throughout the society. And because we don't live on a little island that didn't have any STDs, because we live in an urban society where there are lots of STDs, then this kind of unrestrained sexual behavior, although fun and natural, would nevertheless realistically be disastrous if we weren't intelligent and selective about our sexual partners. So I'm not saying that you should run out and start behaving like Polynesians. What I'm saying is that that would be the natural behavior for young human beings if they didn't have a society that opposed it or prevented it. And the anti-sexual Christian ethic that took over our society 1,500, 2,000 years ago was the result of the Roman Empire having lots of sexual freedom available, particularly for young men. There were lots of slave women who had no choice but to be prostitutes, and there were lots of widows and other people who became prostitutes, so that men in the Roman Empire were going very frequently to prostitutes, and they were passing around STDs everywhere, and including to their wives. And so sexuality really got a bad name during the Roman Empire because people had no condoms, they had no medicines to fight STDs, and they had no knowledge of what kind of microbes were being passed around sexually, because you can't see microbes, they're invisible. So I'm not at all suggesting that we should have the same sexual customs as the Polynesians did. But what I am suggesting is that we could use a much more positive attitude on the part of parents toward their children's sexuality. And if they wanted to keep their children sexually safe, they would try to make sure that they could have a place to have sex with a partner when they were ready to do so, but that they would be very careful about choosing that partner and getting a medical checkup so that they could protect and preserve their sexual health. We have to be not just sex positive, but we have to be totally realistic too in our sex positivity. We can't just go out there taking chances and saying, well, it doesn't matter. We should all be able to do whatever we want sexually. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and just take my chances, because that's unrealistic and it's a bad strategy. I know I've had herpes since 1978, and that's a long time. It's now 2025, and you learn to live with whatever it is that you've got, and I've still had good relationships despite it, but we just have to be realistic that we are much safer if we restrict our very intimate sexual relationships to a very few people who we are sure are just as careful as we are. That's what's important to assess a person's personality. You don't want to be running around with somebody who's just wild and crazy and is throwing caution to the wind just because they're rebelling against all sexual restraint. That's a very dangerous person to be having sex with, even though they may turn you on sexually. Their carefree attitude may be sexually arousing to you, but you should be intelligent as well as sex positive. So I think it would be much better if we all were able to engage in a lot of polymorphous sexual activity that wasn't so physically intimate, that we did have some distance there, so that we weren't passing around microbes. Phone sex is good, something like that. You could have as much phone sex as you wanted, with as many people as you wanted, without getting any STDs, as long as you didn't actually go over and meet them in person and have sex with them, which of course sometimes happens and is always a bad idea, I think. Much better if you've got a good phone sex relationship going, just stick with that. I'm not going to prescribe any behavior for you, but I do think we should be creative about having real fun ways of being sexual with each other. We should be creative with, massages. You can give massages, and if you're touching someone's genitals, you can have one of those little latex gloves on while you're massaging their genitals, and you don't have to worry about giving them microbes or getting microbes from them. You can do a lot of really sexy things. I used to go to the nude beach, and that was very sexy, and it didn't involve any physical contact with anyone. So it was very, very sexually safe, but I had, great sexual experiences to go home and masturbate about and give myself extremely euphoric states of consciousness. So anyway, we need to be creative, and I think parents should be more accepting of their children's sexuality and not be ashamed of it and not feel like the rest of society forces them to make their own children feel ashamed of sex. It's time to stop making children feel ashamed of their sexuality. Okay, well, I'll talk to you again next time. Thanks for listening.